welcome to the Humans vs. Retirement podcast with financial planner and retirement specialist Dan Haylett. In this podcast, Dan explores ways to help you overcome the behavioural, emotional and financial challenges of life after work. Join Dan for the journey where he will explore how our wonderful human brain will naturally fight against what it takes to live a happy, healthy and wealthy retirement. Dan will draw on years of expertise, experience and expert guests to solve the behavioural, emotional and financial challenges of life after work. Now, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Humans vs. Retirement podcast. I'm your host, Dan Haylett, and today's conversation is one that I've been so excited to have as I extend a very warm welcome all the way from the lovely mountains in Utah, author, New York Times columnist, and through his amazing work in making our profession truly world-class, a true inspiration to me and the work that I do, Carl Richards. Carl, welcome to the Humans vs. Retirement podcast.
Thanks, Dan. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, so thanks for having me.
Yeah, can't wait. Since we booked it in, it's been something I've been hugely looking forward to. So, Carl, you know, you're a true expert in making complex financial concepts easy to understand through your wonderful sketches, your two books that are sitting behind me, The Behaviour Gap and the one-page financial plan, which I'm massive fans of, and the groundbreaking work that you do at The Behaviour Gap. And you're obviously a passionate advocate for what you call real financial planning. Before we kind of dive into all these things, I'd really love for you just to spend a brief moment telling the listeners how you've ended up where you are today, because I think it's a really fascinating story.
Yeah, I think it's always tempting to, when you look back on the past, to make up a really clever story that sounds like there was some grand plan, and you hear this all the time. That's what humans do, but I've tried to be really careful about the fact that there was no grand plan, right? And I've worked really hard to get comfortable with the idea that there was a bunch of uncertainty. There was frankly a bunch of luck. There were things that were out of my control that led to this. So that I'm working really hard to preserve and embrace that. So when I tell this story, it's with that in mind. I mean, I applied in college. When I was at university, I was an undeclared major, which in the States means you had no idea what you wanted to do. And I had a job as a landscaper. I was like the newest hire at a landscaping company. So I was literally digging ditches for a living while going to school full time. And I had just gotten married. And I came home one day, my wife, who had graduated with a degree in finance, was looking in the help wanted ads, and she found something we both thought would be interesting. It was, as we recall, as the story goes, and I'm pretty sure because I've double checked this a bunch. We thought it was something to do with security, like a security guard or a mall cop. And we thought it would be great because I could work in the evening and still go to school. I would go to apply for the job, and there was no questions about self-defense or kung fu. It turns out the ad said securities, not security, but I didn't really know the difference. But somehow I got the job anyway. And obviously that tells you about the applicant pool, but I got the job anyway. That ended me up at a big national call center for Fidelity Investments, which is one of the largest, investment firms in the world, really, answering phone calls. And, I remember when I got the job and realized I wasn't a security guard and I was trying to make sense of it. I remember thinking like, oh, it appears that this is a math job, because I didn't know much about investing or money or anything at the time. In fact, I knew nothing, because you certainly don't learn any of that in school. And so I thought, this appears like a math job. There's spreadsheets involved. And then when I got on the phones, actually taking phone calls from humans, and got to see sort of the interaction of like people and their money, particularly as it relates to investments, markets going up and down, I was like, whoa, this isn't about math at all. I just remember I remember being struck by, a little unmoored, frankly, by it. Like, I didn't make any grand conclusions then, but I remember being a little unmoored by the idea that like somebody was angry, somebody else was excited, people were yelling. I was like, what? I don't really understand what's going on. And it was that, like, kind of being interested in that. And again, I'm trying to be careful here not to create a narrative of like, I understood. I didn't understand anything. All I understood was like something interesting is going on here. And that was kind of my first experience with money being not about math and calculators, and it being more about feelings, fear and greed, hopes and dreams. And so I got into the industry by accident, but it was that experience that has kept me interested ever since. I mean, that's 27, 25, 26 years ago. And I found it unending, like sort of unendingly curious about how we interact with money, because largely I think it's the ultimate secret door into what actually matters to people. You know, how we spend our time and how we spend our money will really tell you what we care about and what we value. And so it's that I don't really care about money at all. What I care about is what it tells me about humans and how I can help. Maybe, like with a little bit of luck and a little bit of hard work, maybe I can help them make more sense of aligning their use of money with what's really important to them. And so, you know, that was the beginning. And then it would just be really almost like an unending set of stories that would have the similar theme, which would be luck, maybe like kind of doing public work. I call it playing in traffic. Like, sure, maybe I increased my luck surface area, fine. But then there were still really lucky breaks that happened. You know, ended up at a big newspaper writing a weekly column for them for 10 years. A couple books published. Each one of those steps had similar stories. Like, you know, like I just decided to answer the phone on a Friday. You know, like what if I hadn't answered the phone? It's fine. So that's the story. But again, maybe the linking thread is humans and their money are really curious creatures, and the more we can make sense of that, the better. And there's a real lack, and I'm super curious to talk to you a bit about this because it's really interesting in the UK. I mean, we lived in the UK for a year after spending 4.5 years in New Zealand, and we lived in London, and it's very interesting to see the role that money plays in society there, how we think about it, how it's just like every other place in the world and different. You know, it's super interesting because it says a lot about what we value. And I think it is pretty pronounced, actually, in London specifically. It's pretty pronounced about what you can learn about what we value. So anyway, that's the story. Hopefully that's not too long.
No, amazing. And I think we'll come back to a few things that you said there, but the lesson of kind of moving forward, not knowing what's in front of you, but kind of creating opportunities. And, you know, the plan is wrong the moment it's created. And I think that has huge amounts of consequences for people entering into a retirement, so to speak. It's, you know, you have to kind of create your own vision that you then work towards and have the opportunity to grasp opportunities as you move through life, right? I think it's a great story.
Yeah. Well, thanks.
So look, Carl, this show is about the emotional, behavioural and financial battles that humans have with retirement. And, you know, with that, I am super curious to understand what you believe are the main challenges that we as humans face when it comes to this man-made invention we've come to label as retirement.
Yeah, I mean, listen, let's just start with the idea that it's just a silly idea for humans. Now, there's one big caveat, you know, hard manual labor. You know, there's a point at which we're like, look, I can't physically do that anymore. And I get that and have heard those stories and have had those conversations. But for the bulk of the people listening, we're most likely doing something more akin to knowledge work. You know, like maybe I was an accountant or an attorney or or, we're not. And so the thing we need to realize is that humans were not wired for, and it's interesting because it's like, it's never too late to realize this. The number of conversations I have right now with like 50, 55, 60-year-old people saying, "Hey, is this really what this is supposed to be like?" Like, I think there's an awakening occurring around like, this doesn't work for most people. And let me define what I mean by this doesn't work. The idea that you're going to go full gas till you're 60, 62, 65, 58, whatever that number is. Let's just use 60 as the placeholder. I'm going to go full gas till I'm 60 and then I'm going to golf. And it sounds lovely, but then you quickly realize like, you don't have, and this is, by the way, like, I'm deeply empathetic to this idea. Sorry to get emotional quickly, but I have had so many of these conversations where people are like, they wake up and say, yeah, but I don't have anything at home, right? I don't have a relationship with my spouse and the reason I don't is because I was doing the thing I was told I was supposed to do, right? I thought my job was to provide and protect traditionally. And I'm speaking from a male perspective here. And this is growingly not a gender problem, but my perspective is the only one I have. Like, I thought my job was to protect and provide. I was heads down, making sure my kids were going to have a better future than I ever had because I grew up and I thought that was my job. And now I wake up and I've been working so hard that my relationships are a little distant. I don't have any hobbies. I don't know really what I'm interested in. That's a common story. And I'm deeply empathetic to that story because it was well-intentioned. It's like we all bought into that argument. And to some degree, it was required during certain phases of the last 50 years of people's lives. Like, for many of us, it was required. But and we can be deeply empathetic to that and also say, hey, maybe there's a different way of thinking about it. And what I'm seeing more and more is like, keep in mind, retirement, at least in the United States, the retirement age it's set at 65. It was set at 65 at a time when life expectancy was 63.
Same here. Exactly the same. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So you were going to retire 2 years after you were dead. Now we're talking about 60 to 65, and you're going to live till you're 80 or 85. That's not what we're wired for. So the picture I'm seeing more and more is people saying, okay, maybe this work thing can become a little more optional, but I need to find other ways to find a way to contribute. And that may be rebuilding relationships with the kids and the spouse that I've been a little absent because I've been working. It may be I'm a doctor and I'm a surgeon and I can no longer operate because my hands are getting a little shaky, but I could teach at the medical school or I could volunteer. It may be that I'm a clerk at I worked my way up to become a manager at the local grocery store, and I've always wanted to work at the local garden. And I'll make a lot less, but I won't have to tap into my savings. I can let that keep growing. Like, there's all sorts of flexible ways. The point is, full gas stop is actually causing a lot of pain. And it's especially painful because we expect it to be something else. Like, we've been waiting and waiting and waiting, and everybody told us it was going to be great. And then we get there and it's like, this is pretty boring. Like, we're not wired that way. So that's how I think about retirement. It's obvious I've thought a lot about it. So sorry to unload on you, but that's how I think about it.
Amazing. I think, a lot of the challenges I see just off that is this deep-rooted sense of identity that you get through work, that if you full gas then stop, or you cliff edge this thing and you haven't thought about an identity or multiple identities after work and how they fit in with what you value, the struggle is so emotionally charged. And I think we need to do more work on identity. I think we need to do more work with people in establishing the really great bits that they love about themselves in work and the identity that they cherish, and actually what the identity they want to become. I had a great conversation with a client actually on Monday, I was fortunate enough to stay at his lovely house, and we played golf on the next day. And he stepped back from work last year, and I said to him, if you had to hand out a business card, what would the business card say? Mm-hmm. And he said, it would say, let's call him Paul. It would say, Paul, trying to play the top 100 golf courses in the UK. That's my identity for the next couple of years. And you can see that he's grasped that. I'd love to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's the idea of identity is super important, because we wrap with even the language we use around it. Like we wrap, it sounds ridiculous to say out loud that your value as a human is related to how you earn your income. That's like so ridiculous. Like we'd never do that. We never do that. But we use language like that all the time. Like, what are you worth? Are you getting paid what you're worth? We often don't even say net worth. We literally just say, what's your value? What are you worth? Oh, Johnny's worth X. So we do actually have in our culture and language, we have built up your value is related to your economic status in life. And again, I'm being clear about this. That's like crazy. And we do it. And so when we realize like your entire identity is wrapped up in work, and I think that leads to all sorts of problems, right? Like you're superwoman at the office, you're Superman at the office, but when you come home, you're grumpy. Like there's all sorts of and then when you get home, you're like, everybody at the office really values me. How come everybody around here doesn't see? Like there's all sorts of problems there. And then you exacerbate that by pulling the plug on that source of value that you had created. And so like, what's the solution to that? I mean, the solution to that is just to start asking these questions. They're very uncomfortable. I mean, it's really uncomfortable to admit that like, hey, maybe this thing I built my whole life. There's this old Stephen Covey quote, and I'm paraphrasing, but Covey said something like, the last thing you'd want to do is spend your whole life climbing a ladder only to find out it's leaning against the wrong wall. And sometimes you wake up at 55, 60, 65 and realize, that might have been against the wrong wall. And I can feel a little bad about that. But now I can say to myself, where do I find my value? What could I find that's interesting? Is contribution important? Hey, I love the idea of I'm going to play the top 100 golf course. I've got a buddy that's way into birding right now, like bird watching. And he collects the birds he's seen and he competes with other people. He goes out every morning with his 72-year-old buddy. Two 70-year-olds every morning looking for birds. They're so passionate about it. Well, that's an idea, right? Like that had not occurred to them when they were 65. So it's not, and that's the other thing to think about. Imagine, Dan, just imagine if when you were 30, someone came to you and said, hey, you have 20 years. The next 20 years of your life, I'm going to give you a lifetime of experience and wisdom and connections and relationships. I'm going to give those to you at age 30. What would you build for the next 20 years of your life? And I've been doing that exercise lately. I just turned 50 and I'm like, there's this tendency to sometimes think like, oh, you're closing it down. You're on the tail end. And I was like, well, no, wait. I actually had a conversation with a guy who's 95, who's starting his first venture capital firm. And he's only interested in talking about investments that are 50 years. And I'm like, why don't we play that story more often?
Yeah.
Like if I'm now 60 and somebody comes to me and says, you got 20 years to do, one project, a couple of projects. And guess what? You get the benefit of 60 years of relationships, experience, wisdom. Like that's a gold mine. I mean, I don't mean gold. Like that's just so massively valuable in terms of the contribution you could make if you start thinking like, so I'm thinking like, man, I have 40 years of projects. My average project takes 3 to 5 years, right? So what is that? I have 6, 7, 8 more big projects. What if the criteria for the next project is it's going to make every other project look like a footnote. So how could it be bigger? Oh, I don't have time for that. Yeah, I do. I've got 30 or 40 years. And by the way, I can accelerate the time because I've got all this experience. So I think like rethinking all of that is super valuable to me. And it doesn't have to be like money-making projects. It could be community building. It could be playing every golf course. It could be seeing every bird, like whatever it is. There's got to be something there because otherwise life is going to feel hollow.
I love that. Do you know what is really interesting? What you said for me is if you're 50 or 60, you've probably got more, as you said, wisdom, knowledge, and ability to make the next thing even bigger and better and more valuable to you than 5 years ago, than last year.
Yeah, why would we want to shut that down?
Why slow down? And I think that's what, I frame it in the work that I do with the couples I work with. Those, you call them golden years, but I call them go-go years, which I know is something, these go-go years you've got between the ages of, say, 60 and 75, you've got an amazing opportunity to utilize everything that you've ever learned and actually all the things that you don't like and all the things that you do like. And why would you not want to utilize those skills to be able to create something bigger and better than that's ever happened before?
Yeah, it's what's interesting is this is was this like 5 years ago? I think this is 5 years ago. My wife, we moved to London for my wife to go to interior design school at age 47. And I was so proud of her. And like, that's just amazing. And I think she's got 40 years ahead of her building interior design projects. And she does a project every couple of years. And like one project takes her a couple of years. And there could be 10 projects. And my son one time was saying, hey, mom's going to retire you soon, because like her business was going really well. And I was like, oh, that'd be amazing. And then my son and my daughter, who were teenagers at this point, were like, no, that'd be terrible. Actually, you don't want to retire. And I was like, well, I know that's true. I don't ever plan on retiring. And this is the statement I made. I said, I'm just going to do less of the things I don't like and more of the things that I do. And I happen to love the creative process. And so that happens to work out that like, it looks like I just view business as an art project. So it happens to look like business, but it could be like the neighborhood library or whatever. I'm just going to do less of the things I don't like and more of the things that I do. And my son was like, oh, let's make a list of those things. Like, what are things that you don't like? And we stole it from somebody else. It's a concept, the stop doing list. So we make a list of the things that I find the least energy in, and I try to stop doing one, and I try to pick one every 90 days. And so I told him, I was like, oh, I don't ever want to look at email again. And we made these lists, and my son was like, would you be more or less successful at work if you stopped looking at email tomorrow? If like you found somebody else to do that? I'm like, oh, there's no doubt I would be more successful. So we went down the list. He's like, well, would you be more or less successful? I was like, more. Every single thing I wanted to stop doing, because it would leave me this time and energy for all the things I love and I'm uniquely good at. Like, well, I don't know what I'm unique. I know what I think I'm uniquely good at. I don't know what the world thinks, but I feel like I'm uniquely good at. And my son was like, well, if you would be more successful, quote unquote, at the business, if you stop doing those things, why don't you stop today? And I was like, I will, and we've been working through those over the last couple of years. Like I'm to the point now where like I had a goal that I was never going to touch a keyboard again. That's one of my goals. I don't think I'm actually going to get all the way there, but I'm getting close. Like I'm really close to never, ever looking at my email. Instead, it's a once a week, 90-minute meeting with my team. Like, and the business is doing better. And so that's the way I rethink. Like to me, that's what retirement looks like. The next 30 years of my life look like I'm only going to do projects I love. And out of luck, like it turns out those are financially rewarding, but that doesn't really matter. It like if you're in the position to be able to retire anyway, find something you love. Is it birding? Is it the 100 best golf courses? Is it sailing? Is it the community library? Is it the garden? Is it teaching at the medical school? Like what is it? Do that.
Do you think that we as humans recognize that the best opportunity that we've got to align our values is probably about in our 50s and 60s. Do you think that we do actually understand now, with everything, all the noise that's out there, everything that's been kind of pushed down us in terms of the fear and the greed and all this stuff, and how we have come to recognize what this retirement should be, according to our friend down the pub and all the papers that we read? And do you think we actually fully appreciate the opportunity that's in front of us?
Not at all. I don't think we do at all. I think we're thinking, oh, I'm at the tail end. Let's start shutting things down. Like I'm just going to sit in the pub with my friends and watch the TV most of the days. And I think that's a growing, I'm having more conversations about this than I'm having about anything else, which seems to be my age cohort, 40, like 50, 55-year-olds saying, is this all there is? And if we flip it on its head, I think Chip Conley's done some really cool work around this. His program is called the Modern Elder Academy. And it's almost this exact conclusion of like, wait, he realized after building a couple of boutique hotels, and then he got hired by, like he sold his hotels, he could totally retire. And Airbnb hired him to be sort of like some sort of consultant or on the board. I can't remember what the title was. And he realized like how much he had to offer. Like, yeah, maybe he can't type as fast, and maybe he can't travel and run around and do all those things. But from a wisdom's perspective and like just perspective, and have you thought about this, knowing how to ask the right questions, you realize how much he had to offer. And he's like, I can't believe that this isn't a thing. Like every company should have an elder, that they look to like, and so I don't think we have any clue of that at all, that we're all thinking the same thing, which is, oh man, I'll get to one day, I hate this job, I'm going to retire someday, it'd be amazing. Well, what if you didn't hate the job? What if you found a job you liked? What if you shifted at 40 and thought, instead of having to work till 60 and get out of there the first day I can, you're like, no, my working years just expanded to 70 or 80. And I love the contribution I'm making. So yeah, I know the answer is I don't think we're thinking about that at all. And I think that's why I love the work you're doing and Chip Conley's doing and some of the books we're starting to see about, like, do you realize what you have? You're in the best position ever to offer massive value. It's just different than what you thought was valuable. Like, you're no longer the hunter. You're no longer the warrior. Amazing. Come back. This is the last thing I'll say on this, Dan. Like, I've been working it's really interesting when you realize you're no longer Luke Skywalker. Like, you might have a shot at being Yoda or Obi-Wan, but the people who struggle the most are the ones that are still trying to be Luke. And I think you'd see that in like a hunter-gatherer community. Like, I like to think that I would have been one of the people they sent out on the hunts, because I'm hyper alert. I'm relatively physically okay. Like, I would have been one of those people. And right now, at my age right now, there would be a 25-year-old saying, hey, bro, I don't think we need you to come anymore. And I would have a choice at that point. Am I going to keep trying? Or am I going to, sometimes the hardest thing we can do is say, I'm going to go back to the village. And I've conquered out there. I'm now going to be in here. And instead of trying to keep going out there and becoming, losing myself, like what ends up happening to those people is they become depressed and alcoholic. If you're still trying to be Luke. But if instead you can say, hey, I got all this wisdom, all this experience, where could it be used? How could I be valuable with it? To me, that's the narrative I want to see change.
Yeah, and I think that's the work that I want to put out there. That's the reason for kind of launching this podcast. I think you said really early on, 15 minutes or so ago, that you realized very early in your career at Fidelity that this is not a maths problem. This is a human problem. And I do think that the wider industry, and I'm proud to be part of your real financial planning professional community, but the wider industry still sells this as a math problem. The wider community and the people out there still put themselves and create a spreadsheet to try and get over the problem. And it's not a spreadsheet problem. It's not a maths problem. This is a human problem. This is more work done with people to explore fears, anxieties, as you said, dreams, aspirations, and to help them have those conversations. I mean, I've had conversations with couples that have been married for 30 plus years, and you don't even have to dig that deep in general to get them to a point where they're having a conversation they've never had before about money, because it's such a taboo subject. And some of the looks, you get one look round to the other and go, well, why have you never told me that before? And they go, well, you've never asked me the question before, or we've never had the opportunity to talk to someone independently about this before. And I think, the disservice that happens around that, because we focus on the numbers, and the numbers don't change lives. It's the ability to use those numbers that helps you change the life. And you've done a lot of, you've wrote a lot about that and sketched a lot about that as well.
Yeah. It's fascinating. And it's not, again, it's like, I'm deeply empathetic to that idea that you can be having a conversation with a couple who have been together for 20, 30, 40 years. And I remember this experience. I was with this couple named Darren and Allison, and we were having this conversation, and they had been married a while, and we were talking about money and meaning and the purpose and why and what would you like to do. And Allison said, I love to travel. I'd really like to travel more. And I am not kidding, Dan. Darren fell off of his chair and was like, got back up and was like, what? You've never said that. And she's like, oh yeah, I have. Like, maybe I've never heard it, but and she's like, no, I love to travel. I just thought that you were so busy, you didn't like it. It was like years and years and years of marriage. And I have deep empathy for that. I've had this experience with my wife. So I understand it. Like but the reason that happens is we've never been taught to talk about money. We've only been taught to talk around it. And the reason we stop talking about money most of the time is because we don't have the skill. I know I don't. And when we go to talk about it, if we were taught anything, we were taught it was going to be 1 + 1 always equals 2. It's going to be a rational, it's a math problem, for heaven's sakes. Of course it's going to, why would it be emotional? And then we go to do it, and it's like touching an electric fence that we didn't know was electric. Like touching an electric fence that is electric is one thing. Touching one that I've done this I was on a trail run in Europe, and I was running by, and I was like, oh, look at those cows. And I got too close. And I was like, I looked down, I have a video of it. I was like, that's not an electric fence, is it? And I grabbed it, and it was electric. It's a whole different world when you don't expect it to be electric, and it is. And so I think that's what happens when our conversations around money. We go to have some of these conversations, and there's judgment and shame and fear and greed, often multi-generational epigenetic trauma, stuff that you didn't even know that your great-grandfather used to say, that you've been saying, and you didn't even know that they said it. You discover it in some journal, you're like, wow, where did that come from? I find that I find those conversations a lot. And so if I think, to me, if there was a solution to that problem, it's going into these conversations expecting it. What if your listeners just asked a question? I realized I've been asking this question for maybe 15 years pretty regularly. And I realized the other day that I had never asked my own wife. So I went home and did it. What if you just asked, hey, what's your first memory of money? And then there's a bunch of follow-ups, what was it like growing up in your, what was money like? Do you ever remember conversations? I've been asking a question lately, I just had this conversation with somebody in the UK, actually, for a podcast I'm working on, Ruth. And I asked Ruth if she remembered if she had any recollection of what social class she was in primary school or any of the younger grades. And it was just an amazing conversation. I'd never asked my own wife. So I went home and asked her. It's fascinating. Like, then I started asking my kids, like, what's your first memory of money? So that's the kind of thing I think we could tiptoe in on, having those sorts of conversations with our own spouses and partners, and go into it well-resourced. Like, late at night, it's not a great idea. Rough day at work, like, well-resourced. I even suggest doing it someplace that you don't. I always talk about it as like a semi-decent cafe, like, not your favorite one. Go someplace that, like, it's okay to have the money talk there. Maybe it's out on a walk, and just be really prepared for it. It's not about you, like what you learn. Like, if my spouse said something like, oh, there's so much shame or blame around it when we talk about it, I need to be prepared with, like, oh, tell me more. Not, what do you mean there's shame and blame? It's really hard. So you have to go into it expecting it to be that kind of conversation, not something that fits in a spreadsheet.
And I think that develops an understanding of where each other has been and where you want to get to and what the blockages are. And I've had that, I think, bar none, every challenge I've had with people spending money on both sides of it, whether they're not spending enough or they're spending too much, is deep rooted in something that happened with their parents or their grandparents, or something they experienced when they were younger. And actually, they've never told, as you rightly said, that, but they've never actually communicated that to their husband or wife. So there's frustrations between them that go, why are we not spending money when we've got more than enough, if we want to put it on a spreadsheet, and now we want to create memories and experiences? And the frustration, if it's not discussed and in a proper conversational way without judgment, then I don't think people have much chance of getting over that hurdle. I think it's just going to be a ever fulfilling prophecy of that you're just going to keep going round and round and round, right?
My thought on it is you have two choices. You can either throw in the towel, say, forget it. My wife and I fight about money all the time. We have been for 27 years. They're getting better, right? They're less volatile. Sometimes they're just conversations now. Often they're arguments, and very rarely are they fights, but they used to be fights all the time. We had two choices. I could end the fights. It'd be really easy. Just call it quits and say, forget it. Or we could keep trying. And I think if as soon as we accept that tension, that it's okay, no one taught you how to do this. It shouldn't be a surprise that you're unskilled. Like, I'm unskilled. I think I may have had more conversations about money than anybody alive. I don't know if that's true, but I
think you're right up there. You're definitely
I put myself
right
in the top 10, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I still am terribly unskilled at it. And because no one taught me, I got taught the opposite. I got taught what all of us got taught. That's none of your business. Keep to yourself. We don't talk about money. So deep empathy for all of us. Like, it's fine. There's a reason you're unskilled. And so couldn't you find just a small little way instead of just repeating over and over and over? Can we find a small, what was your, because Dan, can I tell a quick story?
Yep. 100%.
So, and I just want you to notice the empathy that shows up, right? So my friend Aaron, he called me once kind of exasperated, like a little bit frustrated with his wife. And by the way, I'm telling a story where it may sound like the wife was spending money and the husband was mad. By no means am I implying that that's anywhere close to always true. This is just one story, and you're going to find out that it turns out the husband was wrong. So just hang. So Aaron's a little bit exasperated. His wife, who we'll just call Amy, is like, I really need to get a new car. And, it's time. I need to get a new car. And Aaron calls me, he said, this has been coming up for like 6 months. And I don't get it. She doesn't seem to be too concerned about, like, we live in a modest neighborhood. Like, she doesn't seem to be too concerned about having the flashiest house. She has good clothes, but she doesn't seem to be too concerned about the brand name. Like, I don't understand this car thing. It's just over and over and over. She's driving me crazy. We're driving each other crazy about cars. Like, why does she need a new car? I don't understand. We can't. It's really caused problems. He was really worked up about it. And we were like, well, what could you do? He decided to ask, hey, I don't understand. Like, you don't seem to be too concerned about this in any other area. So he sits down and asks in a quiet moment. He's like, Amy, I don't understand. Like, the car thing, it's really actually causing a lot of tension. Like, why do you need a new car? I don't understand. Why do you need a new car? And she was like, oh, Aaron, you don't get it. I don't think I said new. When I was young, my dad, we could only afford an old beat up car. And every time he would drive me to junior high school, so let's just call it 13, 14, 15, you know what it feels like to be that age. I would pull up and all the kids would be getting off the bus and the other kids would be getting dropped off by their parents, and the car would backfire or the car wouldn't start. And he's like, and I remember being broken down on country roads and having to walk a mile to find access to a phone. Like, I remember that, Aaron, and it was super hard. Like, those memories are painful. And I didn't mean to say new. I meant to say reliable. And all of a sudden you feel this, like, I mean, my friend Aaron's response, what he told me was just like, you can feel the deep empathy. Like, oh, of course. Like, oh, of course. So my point is, the new car is not the thing. There's a thing behind it. And if instead we could just be like, wow, that sounds really important to you. And again, I asked my wife, I'm terrible at this at home. Really, really good on a podcast, but terrible at home. Like, if we could instead just say, that sounds like it's really important to you. Tell me more about that. Like, where's that coming from? It doesn't match this other thing. I'm interested in how you see that, right? Because suddenly then there's this empathy. And so having these and again, back to the point of your show and a lot of the work you do, which I know isn't solely this, but there's nowhere I can think of where these conversations would be more important to be aligned than the concept of retirement, where you're suddenly going to be spending a bunch of time together that you better figure out what's on the docket, right? Like, you better be aligned. Well, you better be at least working towards or open to the idea of having these kind of conversations, or it's just going to get more and more volatile because you're going to just be spending all your time together. So anyway, hopefully that's helpful, Dan.
Absolutely. And just one quick statement from me before we kind of wrap up, because I'm conscious that we're nearly at the end of the show. I think, and you've talked before on podcasts I've heard you, that you've had probably as many conversations about money as anybody, as you said, but you have a financial planner. I use the analogy a bit like a builder's house, right? If you go around a builder's house, their house is not finished because they're working on everyone else's projects. And I think sometimes, actually a lot of the time, the reason why we have personal trainers and ski coaches and golf coaches, and it's because they're not us. And it's so important to have someone that's in your corner that can help you along this journey, no matter how much you believe that you know, because we're never as good as what I think we are with other people sometimes when it comes to our own lives.
For sure.
And that's that resonates with me personally on a lot of fronts.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that's a function. It's funny. We had a meeting today with our financial planner that I kind of got fired. So I had to miss part of it to have this conversation, but I was already kind of fired. My financial planner and my wife said, hey, we don't really need you at every one of these meetings. Could you please, we'll just tell you what we decide, which I was so thrilled because it was one of the goals of mine. Like, I don't want to know anything about this. Just let me do my projects. So anyway, yeah. But the point of the financial planner thing is, here's the truth of the matter. You don't hire a financial planner because you're stupid, right? You don't hire a financial planner because you couldn't do it on your own. You hire a financial planner because we have blind spots. And this is the most profound thing you'll hear all day. That's a joke. But by definition, you can't see your own. That's a blind spot is something you cannot see. And I'd be really bummed if I had broccoli between my teeth on a day and nobody told me. You know, I was going to talk to a bunch of people. I was going to give a talk somewhere. I was going to be on a podcast and the video was going to be used. And there's a big piece of green broccoli and nobody ever told me. But so I like having people around that will say, hey, I'm not and sometimes it's a punch in the face. And sometimes it's an empathetic hug. And I got to be prepared for both. But sometimes it's like, hey, bro, I'm not sure you know this, but the way you handle that, it's not good. Hey, you guys told me that your most important thing is travel together, and yet you're spending all this money on this. You know, like, this isn't matching up. Would it be okay if we talk about it? I love it when somebody says to me, like, hey, you might fire me for the advice I'm about to give you, but you should definitely fire me if I don't. Like, that's why I hire planners, to tell me the kind of stuff that I might be mad about until I have a minute to cool off. But it's the inconsistent behavior that they see. It's inconsistent. I said this is what I valued. I'm doing this. There's an inconsistency there. Who do you have in your life that dares go into that space? Like, there's a strong disincentive to not go in that space. Like, your kids aren't, I mean, you know, a good friend, maybe, you know, your spouse, maybe on a good day, but have you ever tried it? Like, it doesn't go very well. So that's why we have a planner.
Amazing. So, Carl, as we wrap up, I've got 3 questions that I want us to very briefly go through over the next 3-4 minutes, if that's good for you.
Totally.
You've already semi-answered this, but what will Carl Richards' retirement look like?
Yeah, it'll be a series of projects, creative projects that are optimized for the impact they'll have. And I'll just, with big chunks of open space in between them, which is basically, it'll look like the last 10 years. The next 20 or 30 years will look like the last 10 years, only hopefully bigger in terms of impact.
Fantastic. More time in the mountains thinking about that, right?
Yeah, time in the mountains thinking about it, in the studio doing it.
So, and I want to wind you back to your days being a financial planner. But for the listeners, so if I'm sitting across the desk from you, I'm 55, I've established that I've got enough money for the retirement that myself and my wife desire. What would be your number one tip for a happy, healthy, and wealthy retirement?
Find a way to continue contributing, however that looks.
Sounds easy, but
yeah.
There you go.
And so let's just break that down super fast. Like, how do you do that? Because I get asked that question all the time. Like, I don't have anything. I mean, of course, if I had something, I would do it. Well, you guess, right? Like, go look at what you read when nobody else is around. You know, like, what magazines do you subscribe to? You know, are you just super into rugby? Is there a local club that you could volunteer at? Is there, like, just guess. And then once you guess, all you do is you just go try it. And what you do is you try it is you actively look for, I think this is a good idea, and then actively look for disconfirming evidence. I like the model of, like, just have a strong opinion, loosely held. So you feel like you're all in, but you know there's an asterisk that's like, as soon as if there's any, so because you don't know, like, oh, I want to sail around the world. Well, Dan, have you ever been on a sailboat? Well, okay, maybe go on a sailboat first. I'd love to cook more. Hey, well, I'd love to start a restaurant. Invite 8 friends over and cook for them. You know, like, you don't even have to say, I'm starting a restaurant, just invite. So just small little micro actions. You're just placing little bets. That's the way I think about it, like little bets. And then as you feel like, whoa, that felt great. I love that. And you can go more in and more in and more in. And then you wake up one day and you're like sailing around the world, if that's what the thing is. Or you've opened the restaurant, or you're having a monthly dinner at your house, or you're the head of the local rugby club and you're making a massive impact on all the youth and everybody involved in the club. So just guess. Nobody else knows either. And then I find that instead of analyzing and researching, go act. Like, physically do something, because new information will show up in the act that you couldn't get by researching. You just won't be able to get it. So go act, and then see what you learn from act, and then adjust.
Micro actions, isn't it? You've talked a lot about that, which is
just little micro actions.
Step by step.
They're micro scary.
Yeah.
You know, like just go try one.
Yeah. So, Carl, lastly, you have been on many podcasts. I'm a big fan of your work with Michael Kitces and obviously your work in general. You've been on many stages, giving amazing talks. You've done interviews across the world. What's the one question you've never been asked but you wish you had?
I don't know. I mean, maybe this is taking the easy way out, but I was on a podcast with Jess Bost, who really I love it anytime. So the question that I always wanted to be asked that very rarely do people ask, and that's this, like, why? You know, like, let's get a little deeper. Like, why was that important? What is it about the work that you do that you really care about? Like, trying to get down there. And many of the questions you've asked, like, these are all largely like deeper questions. You know, what I can't stand, Dan, is like, what do you think of the market today? And what do you think of inflation? And you know, all of those questions that don't actually really, and the reason, I feel like I'm skirting the question a little bit, but the reason is those questions are all hacking at the branches. And the questions I'm only interested in now, like, I'm not even interested in, I can hardly get myself to even stomach those questions. Which app should I use? How should I invest my money to be on? I mean, look, important, but they actually don't matter. They're important, and they don't matter at all if we don't get the root problems solved. And what you've spent the time today talking about are the root problems. Why does it matter? What do you value? How do you deal with it? How do you talk about it? Those are the only thing I really want to talk about. So luckily for me, more people are asking those questions these days.
Carl, that is an amazing place to finish. And I really want to thank you for taking your time out of your busy diary to share your wisdom and knowledge with myself and the listeners today. So thank you so much for that. Links to all of Carl's work and the books and the sketches and everything will be available on the show notes. So Carl, thank you so much for this.
Cheers, Dan. Thank you. And please keep doing the work you're doing. It's super important.
Appreciate that. So, and thank you for listening to the Humans versus Retirement podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with me today. Until next time, take care.
Thank you for listening to the Humans versus Retirement podcast. Subscribe to be notified when new episodes become available. We would love to have you along for the journey. If you like what you heard, then we would appreciate you taking a few minutes to leave us a review. And lastly, if you want to explore your retirement plans further, download our free 7-step retirement GPS toolkit linked in the show notes. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of TFP or Dan Haylett. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, so please always seek the advice of professionals with any questions you may have regarding your retirement.